does its own thing. Okay, let's move on to item 4. Pension fund valuation update. Alistair.
Thanks, convener. So really, just as the first sentence of the report says, this is outlining the initial findings of the 2020 valuation exercise. There is quite a detailed analysis attached at Appendix 1. At this stage, worth noting, this is just the results, the valuation results at a whole fund level. There is some further work going on which will calculate the funding position of the various employers and determine their contribution rates individually. So that work will be progressed over the coming weeks. Section 3 of the report provides some context to the valuation exercise, which should be pretty familiar to us all, I think, by now. Perhaps just worth drawing attention to paragraph 3.4, where it's noted that we considered a funding strategy statement at the September meeting and agreed to circulate that to unions and employers. So at this point in time, there's been no comments received in relation to that. So we will bring a finalised version of the strategy statement to the March committee for approval, along with the finalised valuation report from the actuary. Just turning over leaf. So fundamentally, the valuation is all about assets and liabilities, and para 4.2 notes that assets are calculated at their market value at March 2020, and the liabilities are calculated as being the amount of money that the fund needs to hold going forward to meet its benefit obligations. Para 4.3 notes that the actuary can drill down into the assets and liabilities and determine these at an employer level, and that's what they'll be doing to calculate the individual contribution rates. Para 4.4 notes that this is all done by the actuary making a series of assumptions about various things, and that includes investment return, inflation, salary growth, life expectancy. Section 5 just goes into a bit of detail about how the assumptions have been derived, bearing in mind that we agreed these at the August meeting, and Section 6 sets out the initial result of the valuation, noting at 6.1 the funding level is 94%, a slight improvement from the 2017 position. I'm sure when Julie comes in, she will emphasise that the funding level is just a snapshot in time, and the important issue is that the fund has sufficient monies available to meet its ongoing commitments. Nevertheless, I think it's gratifying that we have seen a marginal improvement in funding, especially given the kind of battering that some of the assets have taken since March as a result of the pandemic. So maybe at that point, convener, if I could invite Julie to say a few words about the valuation exercise, where we've got to. I know that Julie circulated we circulated a paper that Julie had authored. So I'll hand over to Julie at this point.
Hello, convener. Can I come in there first of all?
Of course you can.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Sandy.
All right. Sorry. Unfortunately, I'm actually having to do this through my phone now, because we don't get access to WebEx from Stirling Council, I'm afraid. It's Teams that we normally use, so I've had to go through a convoluted way, and I can't even see anybody in the screen, so I don't even know that I've gained access. That's what I'm talking now. So, okay, at least I'm here, all right, and I can hear what's going on. I've got the papers, etc. So, right.
That's great. Thanks.
Okay,
I don't know if we can look in the future at moving to Microsoft Teams, Brian, but maybe that's something we can discuss after the meeting. Okay.
Either that, or I'll try and get hold of IT and see if I get access to it. I'll have a word with him.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry. Thanks, Julie.
Okay, thank you. Morning all, and thanks for having me along this morning. I'm hoping to be able to share my screen and when I can talk through the slides as we go. Hopefully they'll come through. There we go. Okay, so Alistair's done a really good introduction there of the valuation position. I was just going to go into a little bit of detail on where we are in the process and a bit about the results and why the results look the way that they look. So far, we have received the data from the fund, which was of excellent quality. So thanks very much to Alistair and Debbie and Justina for that. So we look at the membership data and we look at the cash flow data and we check that all of those things are consistent. So that was a really straightforward process for us this year, which is great. It allows us to plough on with the valuation calculations. We've done the assumption setting part of the process earlier in the year. As Alistair mentioned, we signed off those assumptions earlier in the year, and the funding strategy statement, which sets out the way in which we plan to calculate contributions, that's been issued for consultation. And we're at the stage where whole fund results are complete, and there's work ongoing on the individual employer positions. A bit of a recap on assumptions. So this is all these assumptions were agreed earlier in the year, with the exception of the investment return assumption, and I'll show why on the next slide. So the assumption used for CPI that influences future benefit increases, that's dropped quite significantly from 2017 to 2020. And we did some analysis on what we thought could happen in terms of future salary increases, and that's also dropped. That's dropped because of the drop in inflation. So we've derived that assumption as a margin above CPI. So it's dropped from 2.9% to 2.3%. So to set the discount rate, and this is what Alistair was speaking about earlier. When we're calculating a funding position, that really is highly dependent on that single set of assumptions. So in 2017, you could have expressed your funding position really anywhere along that grey line. And at 2020, you could choose to report your funding position anywhere along the blue line. And that might seem a bit counterintuitive. So probably in the past, we've come along and said, this is your funding level. But actually, we're very conscious of the fact that because the funding level is so dependent on a single set of assumptions, actually, it can be quite easy to be to hang your hat really on that single number, and which is potentially a dangerous thing to do if you don't understand how likely it is for the assumptions underlying that to be borne out in practice. So what the blue line shows us is on the bottom axis, we've got the future investment return. So where your funding level would be if you got that future level of investment return and the likelihood of that happening. So actually in this example, if the fund were able to assume that they got 3.6% per annum each and every year in the future, we think there's about a 70% chance of that happening, then the fund would be roughly 100% funded on that reported position. With discussions with the fund's officers, we've adopted to choose the 75% level. So in 3 out of 4 future cases, we would expect the investment returns achieved by the fund's assets to return in excess of that. And that's where the discount rate of 3.2% comes from. And with a discount rate of 3.2%, the funding level is 94%. So the reason I've put this chart in, and as Alistair said earlier, is to emphasise that it's not just all about the funding level. When a fund is 100% funded, that's not job done. There's still lots of future risk in there. You've got lots of benefits to pay and lots of future uncertainties. So we're really trying to make sure that when we report a funding level, because we have to report a funding level, it's a requirement, that there's an understanding of what that actually means. Okay, any questions on that before I move on? No, okay.
No.
And so that's the financial assumptions aspect of it. We also look at the demographic assumptions. That's the assumptions that influence when the benefits will be paid and for how long the benefits will be paid. The fund uses Club Vita to set their life expectancy assumptions. And what that means is that for every member in the fund, they have their own life expectancy assumption based on the factors that influence life expectancy. So those factors are things like their postcode, and basically postcode and salary or pension and payment are the two biggest drivers of that. And which means it will also capture any regional variations that may exist at employer level, and potentially the types of work that people do at individual employers as well. And we take advice from Club Vita. There's 2 aspects to your life expectancy assumption. There's what life expectancy is today, and there's how we expect life expectancy to change in the future. That's the future improvement assumption, and we take advice from Club Vita on that as well to set an appropriate future improvement assumption. And future improvements, so there's been some talk in the press about pre-COVID, we'll take COVID out of the equation for now, and there was some talk in the press about a drop in life expectancy, which isn't strict. What has happened is that the rate at which life expectancy was increasing has slowed. And that's why when we look at the how you've got from your 2017 results to 2020 results, you'll see that there's a gain resulting from our change in life expectancy assumptions. We also take input across all of the Scottish funds. We look at what has happened, so using observed data to set appropriate rates for things like how many members may die in service, and the rates of ill health, early retirement, and how many people we expect to leave employment prior to retirement. And we set a set of what we call demographic assumptions that are appropriate for the Scottish funds. And finally, we also have a conversation with the fund about an appropriate level to set an assumption for individuals taking the 50/50 scheme. This number makes so little difference to the final answers because so few people have chosen to take up that option. But the government actually, when they do a review of the valuations across all of the Scottish LGPS, they like to see that funds have considered their own experience and are setting these assumptions at a fund specific level. Okay, so how does your funding position look? Sorry. Is there a question?
Yeah, can I come in there, Julie? See the funding that you're basing our one at 94%. How does that fare compared to the rest of the Scottish pension funds?
It's very much part of the pack, I would say. So some better, some worse.
Yeah.
And all funds will also have taken their own view on and the way in which they want to express their funding position as well. So some funds may have taken a view to express their funding level at a different point on that blue line. So the government actually does carry out a review across all of the Scottish LGPS where they compare all of the funds on the same set of assumptions, which gives which really, because as I've mentioned, because the funding level is so influenced by assumptions, it's really easy. Your one fund could be reporting 110% and one fund could be reporting 90%, but actually without understanding what those assumptions are and how likely they are to be borne out in practice, it doesn't actually tell you how likely it is that those funds have the money to pay the benefits.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yep. So as Alistair mentioned, your funding level has increased from 92 to 94%, and a decrease in deficit from 184 million to 152 million. What's helpful to understand is the changes between the two valuations and how we've got to that position. So there's quite a lot in this table, but it does set out how your assets have changed and how your liabilities have changed, and the resultant impact on your surplus or deficit. So your assets grow by the money the employers pay in, employees pay in, investment returns, and obviously decrease by any benefits that are paid out. So that's the first column there. Your liability column. So your liabilities grow every year with, we would call it interest. That interest is because those benefits are a year closer to being paid. So you have a year less to earn investment returns. So that is sometimes we get questions about why are we being charged interest. So it's really to do with the way in which liabilities are calculated, and that we discount back each of those future payments with an allowance for future investment returns. So interest has increased liabilities by 265 million. An additional accrual of benefits is 318 million. If you look at the contributions that have come in versus the accrual of benefits, you'll see that the contributions aren't quite covering the benefits that continue to accrue, which shows us from a fund perspective, you are heavily reliant on investment returns. So contributions coming in really keep the ship afloat, and it's really investment returns that could allow the fund to really change direction. So it's just helpful to think to see the relative impact of some of the items in this table. We look at all items of membership experience. So we drill down into this membership experience item, which is a more detailed version on the report that we've shared with the fund. So comparing things like what's happened in terms of salary increases and pension increases, and we compare the experience against all of the assumptions that was made. But typically it's a small item. At fund level, generally it's a small item between valuations. So as I mentioned, inflation has dropped from 2.4% to 1.7% at the valuation date. That decreases the value we place on liabilities because we think future benefit increases will be less. So that's a big gain. As I mentioned, we've changed the demographic assumptions, so not allowing for mortality in there. That's a small gain as well. And then there's a much bigger gain from the underlying longevity assumptions, and that's to do with that slowing down of future life expectancy increases. When we set the benefit increase assumption, so there's no market indicator for CPI at the moment. We look at RPI less a margin, and that's dropped slightly from a margin of 1% to a margin of 0.9%, which leads to that small gain of 35 million there. salary increase assumption has moved slightly from a CPI plus 0.5 to CPI plus 0.6%. The salary increase assumption itself now also makes quite a small impact on results, so it can be something that employers can become really interested in because it's something that's within their control. But because of the relatively small proportion now of benefits that are final salary linked, any changes to the salary increase assumption typically don't have a material impact on the liabilities quoted. And then finally, the future investment return assumption has dropped from 3.5 to 3.2, so that reflects a more cautious market outlook on what your assets may do in the future, and that increases the liabilities by 122 million. But overall, there is a decrease in the deficit over that period. Okay, any questions on that before I move on? No, okay. So the next steps are, thankfully we've done part of it. We've done an exercise to set contributions for the bodies who are allowed to stabilise contributions. So where we have a predetermined strategy that we look at each formal valuation and check it's still appropriate. So we've agreed the contribution rate approach for those stabilised employers, which is a large majority of the fund. We're in the middle of calculating contribution rates for the employers that are remaining. So typically the smaller organisations in the fund. We're planning to discuss those with the employers in January, and in March will be time for sign off of the funding strategy statement and the final formal valuation report. Okay. So that's all from me, but I'm happy to take any questions on anything valuation related.
Thanks, Julie. That was an excellent presentation. Very helpful. Have we got any questions? Once Julie stops sharing the screen, I'll maybe be able to see everybody. No questions?
Jennifer, I can't see the wee hand sign, so I'm having to talk.
That's fine, Jennifer.
Really, it was just to ask Julie how you'd reflected the change to the administration of the fund, and obviously the fact that we hope to reduce the ongoing administration costs and investment costs with the work we're doing with Lothian.
Yeah, so that feeds through into there's an assumption set for expenses. So we'll look at the money that's been spent, so what goes through the accounts effectively on the running of the scheme. We look at that in the accounts and we set an assumption as a percentage of pay. So the assumption actually for Falkirk was low already. It was 0.2% of pay. I think there's a slight increase this time to 0.3% of pay. But as we move through future valuations, any decreases in cost will come through in that item. So we've not taken account of it yet. It's a backward-looking assumption. We assess what has been paid.
Has anyone got any other?
I think the object of the policy is really set out in para 1.2, namely to have some suitable controls in place in relation to managing our cash balances, and the actual policy itself is attached as an appendix. Maybe come back to the recommendations slightly later. Section 3 of the report is explaining the rationale for us holding the cash, which is obviously to pay benefits and also to fund our ongoing investments, and these requirements are obviously offset by employer contributions, dividends and distributions that we receive. Para 3.2 highlights some of the changes that we've made to the policy. So written in a plainer English style, we've taken the opportunity to update counterparty information and also tweaked some of the cash limits. That's really on the back of the security of capital first, then liquidity, then the return or the yield. And the second main priority is we want to minimise our cash balances, but recognise we do need to trade, we need to pay pensions, and even at certain times we might want to hold cash as a defensive measure in times of market volatility. You know, if you can imagine perhaps a nation leaving a trading block without an ongoing agreement, a hypothetical situation perhaps, but you know, it could give rise to some volatility. So in our strategic asset allocation, we are permitted to hold up to 10% of the fund in cash. 3.6 in the report notes that the council has its own treasury management team, so we're fortunate to be able to tap into that from time to time, and by extension to that treasury team's professional advisors. Section 4 is just looking at in a bit more focus at the actual holdings themselves. I guess noting the roles of the Royal Bank of Scotland in our day-to-day transactional business, and Northern Trust, who are the provider of our investment banking needs. Our cash holdings at November are set out in 4.4, and you can see spread across a range of counterparties. And I think that just takes us to the conclusion, noting that we do have this framework in place, the cash management policy. We're monitoring the cash both from an operational and an investment perspective, and within that there is scope for us to report any material breaches to the committee and board. And that just takes us to back to the recommendations, inviting committee and board to note the report and ask for committee approval for the report. Thanks, Convener.
Thanks, Alistair. I see John's got his hand up. You're on mute, John.
I'm sorry. Thank you, Convener. And Alistair, just under 4.4, could you just give me the detailed explanation of the Aberdeen Standard Liquid Fund? Just exactly where is that when we're used to talking about, about banks like Royal Bank, etc. Could you just give me the background where this one comes in?
It's a AAA rated money market fund. So that is one of our approved counterparties. I think Justina will keep me right here, but I think previously they were, was it Ignis?
Yes, it was previously Ignis, and after a merger between Standard Life Capital with Aberdeen, they've merged the cash funds they had and became Aberdeen Standard.
Thank you. Just that follows actually leads into my second question. You explained that the Aberdeen Standard is a money market vehicle, and I was about to ask just exactly to what extent our policy is for regarding daily investment to the money market, and to what extent the funds are left with the named depositors, or or is it a daily move to the money market?
Justina, do you want to pick that up? Or?
The fund had this holding for a while, and we can draw the money on a daily basis. So if we do have a need, we can in the morning we could instruct and get the money back. So there is the risk is there is not a very high risk with this.
Okay, thank you. I should explain, Alistair, that in a previous existence, many years ago, it was my job with the Royal Bank of Scotland to cooperate with Falkirk to arrange daily transfers to the money market. And I was just curious to know, nowadays, different days I know, but just curious to know to what extent the funds are being left with the banks as detailed in 4.4. And to what extent they're being transferred daily to the money market.
Just to confirm, we have not done the transfer. We are keeping this almost like a deposit, just trying to spread the amount of cash that we had available between the approved counterparties. So we have not done a transfer to that fund for quite a while.
I see. Okay.
I think it's probably worth just saying that the interest rates from all of these funds is so low at the moment that it really doesn't warrant a lot of tactical movement. I think going back to our objectives, it's about having the security and the liquidity being the primary drivers, I think.
Thank you very much for that.
Okay.
Any other questions? No? Happy to agree the recommendations? Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you. Swiftly moving on. Item 6. Now, before I ask Alistair to speak on item 6, I want to draw your attention to paragraph 10, where it highlights that Alistair is leaving us. Not quite yet, but Alistair obviously has been an active member in the Falkirk Pension Fund for a very long time, and he was with Central Region, I believe, before that. So he will be a huge miss. It'll certainly be a huge miss to me because, as you are probably well aware, I was thrown in at the deep end a few years ago, and Alistair has steered this ship and steered me very, very well, and I appreciate everything that you've done to support me, Alistair, and I like to say thanks on behalf of the committee and board for all your input over the years. And I know you're not quite going away yet, but I do want to highlight that you cannot fit 5 days into a 2-day post, and please be aware of that. I think, Brian, would you like to say a few words? Brian Smale.
Thank you, convener. Really, just to echo what you've said there. Alistair doesn't go away quite yet, so he will be in the background, and I'm sure there will be occasions when he will appear before committee and board on particular items. But on your latter comments, convener, I think we do need to respect the reality of his changed position. He is part-time and is a lower level grade to accommodate the flexible retirement criteria. But a great believer in accentuating the positive where we can, and the mere fact that Alistair will be there and someone we can touch base on is something to very much welcome. And just to conclude, to thank Alistair for his sterling service in the current role of manager over all these years, and extending back to reorganisation in 95, 96, and when we would have worked for Central Region and the Pension Fund, which of course came across to Falkirk in that reorganisation. So with that, I'll stop and thank you, Convener.
Thanks.
Convener.
Can I come in here, Convener?
Yes, Andy, then John.
Yeah, right. I think it'd be remiss of me not to add to the plaudits as well for Alistair, and through the trade union side and the lay members on the committee there. I think it's been excellent, and the support that we've got from him is very clear, explaining some of the more difficult elements and daunting things to do with finance that whenever we come into the committee and the board, and he can explain things very, very clearly to us. A great help, and and what you've got to remember is what the convener says, Alistair, is you can't try and do all the work in the 2 days now. That's very important. You've got to stand back. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. John?
Yeah, thank you, Convener. I don't intend to say very much, but I feel that having been easily the oldest in various ways, including my almost 25 years coming up now on the pension committee, perhaps I get a wee sort of little shield for that. But I've got to say that I've had so much experience of the help and support and from Alistair, and the countless times when the difficult and confusing has been made reasonably clear. And I can only say thank him very much personally, and I'm delighted to say that completely the pension fund will not be entirely losing his guidance and service. I just wish him well and thank him very much for past contributions and support to the scheme.
Yeah, excellent.
Thanks, John. Simon?
Likewise, on behalf of the board, thanks very much. And Alistair, you've kind of overseen the advent of the board and supported us all to understand our roles and responsibilities so clearly and calmly and patiently. Thanks very, very much, and all the best for the future.
Convener, I think I better come in because I'm worried John won't get away for his 12:30.
Don't you worry. Yes, come in, please. Thanks, Alistair.
Thank you for all these very kind words. As Brian was saying, I'm moving into the chorus line and the supporting cast, rather than being out front. My problem is I'll have to get used to doing what I'm told now rather than pleasing myself. But I'm used to that at home, so it'll I should manage to fit that in okay. I think we better get on with the agenda though. Definitely.
Okay, thank you, Alistair.
Thanks. Okay, so the general governance report, items 3 and 4, I think, kind of speak for themselves. We've got a new appointee to the union side on the board. Unfortunately, David can't join us this morning. Item 4, you'll see that we did receive an unqualified audit opinion from EY, so that part of the process has been completed. Section 5 harks back to the discussions we had on the fund merger, so that you'll recall in September it was agreed that we would commit an amount of money to engage consultants to undertake a feasibility study in relation to merger with Lothian. So if we go to 5.2 in the paper, you'll see that the consultant has been appointed. They've started work, and they're kind of zeroing in on a number of work streams, including admin, investments, governance, actuarial, etc. Parallel to these work streams going on, we are still looking to make progress ourselves on projects like iConnect and digitising of records. And these are things that we need to do anyway, just to modernise operations, irrespective of whether it's merger or no merger. We're expecting the consultant to come back towards the beginning of March, so if necessary, we can convene a special meeting to discuss that. And in view of the significance of this work stream, I've asked internal audit to include it in their audit programme for the fund for the current year. Section 6 of the report outlines the latest developments in the MacLeod age discrimination case, really noting that the Scottish Government's consultation on how the discrimination was to be addressed is now closed. Of the responses that we contributed towards, then the main themes of these were, this is very going to be quite expensive. You can see, I think, a number of 355 million is quoted there. There's uncertainty over the final cost. It's going to be very complicated. We're all going to have big headaches from an administration perspective. Para 6.6 gives a little flavour of how severe the admin overhead could be. Hymans Robertsons did a bit of initial scoping for us on this, and they reckoned we could have about almost 10,000 records that might require some sort of review. So, we'll be very much hoping that IT can ride into a rescue on a lot of that. Section 7, just a little update on the impact of COVID on the number of our pensioner deaths that we've had. We've got a chart there that shows the experience over the last 3 years. So the green and the blue lines are the month-on-month deaths in 2018, 2019, whereas the yellow line is clearly the 2020 experience, showing that we had our initial spike back in the spring. Maybe more surprising, we did have a bit of a spike in August, early September. Happily, we've not had the big second wave spike that you might have expected, which is good news. It's probably going to be some time before we know exactly what the long-term trends are emerging out of the pandemic. But as Julie was mentioning earlier, we subscribe to Club Vita, so we should be well positioned to have a good handle on any changes in longevity trends. Section 8 of the report is our usual corporate governance summary. So there's reference to the various engagements that have been undertaken by the LAPFF. You'll note in 8.4 and 8.5 of the report that we've put our name to a couple of letters, one in relation to the activities of mining companies, urging them to be more respectful of local communities in pursuing their operations. And 8.5, the letter was in relation to urging it was to the Prime Minister on behalf of a number of investors, calling for an ambitious national determined contribution towards reducing carbon emissions in line with the Paris Agreement. So the theme of reduced carbon emissions is very much to the fore in Para 8.6. The DWP had issued a consultation on the type of information that pension funds should be disclosing. This is on the back of the work done by the task force on climate change financial disclosures that have been going on. So that these are kind of voluntary disclosures. So this consultation is looking to make some of these disclosures mandatory. I think it's liable to start with the larger pension schemes, but it's likely to be a rolling programme that will eventually cascade down to the smaller funds. And they will be looking for funds to disclose in climate-related risks, show how you're reflecting that in your investment decision making, and you're doing scenario analysis. So I think there's quite a significant overhead coming along that we'll need to address. So I think I'll leave it there. There's quite a lot in the governance report this month, but happy to take any questions or comments on these. Thanks, convener.
Thank you, Alistair. Do we have any questions? No?
No.
Happy to agree with the recommendations? Agree?
Yeah.
Thank you. Moving on to item 7, and that's with you, Brian.
Thanks, convener. To some degree, there's continuity with the latter part of Alistair's general update there in terms of the environmental considerations. This, I think, is a very positive report, as it proposes how we can further improve our responsible investment credentials. As you know, we already have, as we're required to, a statement of investment principles, the SIP. The new document, the very similarly sounding SRIP, there's an extra R in there, is complementary, but it's more focused and provides more of a cutting edge, I think. And this reflects the direction of travel, the trend, and the expectations of our stakeholders, including scheme members, regulators, and indeed the society in general. So section 5 of the report sets out the key elements of this SRIP, starting with our previously agreed beliefs. And I think if I can just draw your attention to the short para 5.2, which I think is an important one, which deals with the high-profile issue of divestment, and I think is specific evidence of that cutting edge that I referred to earlier. And I think just adds a bit of credibility to our stance on this issue. But also draw your attention to paras 5.3 and 4 and the actual principles that the committee is being asked to approve. And you can see the pedigree in terms of the source of where those principles come from. There's a focus on climate change as detailed at para 5.5, and para 5.6 touches on suggested monitoring arrangements in terms of tracking this agenda as we go forward. And with that, convener, if I can just return to the recommendations which speak for themselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Now, the board and the committee are invited now to add any comments. Do we have any comments? No?
Can I just say, convener,
Yep.
that I welcome that paper there, Brian, and it's very good because we do have some pretty active members in our pension fund in the Stirling side of things, so this is a good thing for it to share with them, to let them know that we have got our finger on the pulse here and we know what we're doing as far as investment's concerned and where our direction's going with the fund managers, etc. So that's well done. Thank you.
Thank you.
Jennifer.
Okay, John, then Jennifer.
No, sorry, Jennifer. I do apologise. I wouldn't have deliberately stood in front of you there. Just simply to say that it's not a question, but simply to say that I'm more than pleased that we put the emphasis so strictly on the problems regarding climate change. It's certainly something which is vitally important, and certainly for Falkirk Council, I'm more than pleased that we're becoming more and more alert to the issues and the dangers and the responses. But it's very good to see this is given the prominence through the pension fund. Thank you.
Yes, totally echo that, John. Thanks. Jennifer?
I was just going to say I totally agree with what's been said by Sandy, and this sort of statement is really helpful when dealing with our members' questions, because obviously our employees are quite vocal on environmental topics and climate change, and I think this really goes a long way. And I think the movement and direction of travel that Falkirk's demonstrated in the last 5-10 years is really helpful in that picture, in that you have obviously been listening to stakeholders and you're trying to take a moderate person or a reasonable person's approach to how we deal with these risks and the move in the whole way that pensions are considered. So I really support it, and I think it's great. And I think that the fact that you're tying up your approach in terms of how you've written your narrative on your annual report and accounts is all really helpful to us in communicating to our members of the fund. So thank you very much for that.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Jennifer. Anyone else? No? I think it's important that, you know, that we do work with all our stakeholders, but there does come a time, if there is possible constant offenders, that the decision to divest is probably the right way to go. Thanks. Everyone happy with the recommendations?
Yeah.
Great. Moving on to item 8, and that's with yourself, Bruce. Thank you.
Yeah, Bruce.
Sorry, is that better?
Thank you.
So, you know, that last item ties in really importantly with the next item, and you know, it's helpful for stakeholders, that statement. I think it's also helpful communicating with the underlying managers of the fund. So that's really important too, that they understand where the pension fund's coming from and what it needs. So, you know, this is the regular update on investment market developments and the presentation of the strategic allocation and you know, monitoring activity from the GISP. So just on section 3 in the market review and outlook, I won't say much. I mean, Alistair is obviously around events at the end of this year. We can't predict those. We'll just have to wait and see. But I mean, just to comment that the portfolio is global in nature, you know, and therefore it's well diversified, and we don't think, you know, that over the long term this will be a major issue in the lifetime of the fund. I would maybe point to the nature of the obviously COVID. We had a big fall early in the year and a big rebound later in the year, and that rebound really focused on a very narrow number of stocks in the equity market. Some of the really mega cap stocks, you know, we've mentioned Facebook, Amazon, Alphabet, Netflix, Microsoft, all sort of household names, and those have led the market. But it's been narrow, and not all stocks in the market have gone up. I would just highlight, as again, Alistair mentioned, that the interest rates are very, very low. That's not just cash rates, that's gilt rates as well. And that has an impact on the fund. Going to section 4, really just the regular table that we have, just highlighting managers within their policy groups of equities, real assets, non-gilt debt, gilt and cash. And you'll remember that Simon suggested it would be useful to try and create a table showing what the allocation would be if we allocated the Baillie Gifford diversified growth to each of those policy groups. So we've had a go at that in table 3, section 4.4, and it shows you that there are some modest changes to the weights. With the equity would be up slightly, a couple %, and there'd be less. We're basically closer to the benchmark overall. So that's kind of helpful to see. And then on fund returns in section 5 and the tables that are related in appendix 1, just to highlight that the returns are low single digits for the fund as a whole over the 3-year period, and the 5-year period 8%, a little bit behind the benchmark. And I just comment on the benchmark. The benchmark, it's very much a long-term benchmark, and we see that in certain policy groups such as the non-gilt debt, sorry, the real assets group, where there's quite a significant difference between the benchmark and the underlying return, because they're not really measuring exactly the same thing. It's really a target and an objective over the long term. So there are some difficulties with the short term data there. With that, I think I'll go back and ask you to note the paper, and I'm available for any questions, obviously, and I think Albert's on the call also. So if there's any difficult ones, I can pass them over to him.
Thank you, Bruce. Do we have any questions? Simon?
Thank you, Bruce. Much appreciated that you've incorporated the analysis of the Baillie Gifford diversified growth portfolio. I was particularly interested in real assets, actually. I mean, it means that it shows that we're actually almost at the strategic allocation for real assets, which we wouldn't have got without that analysis. I had a quick question about the Chancellor's announcement about RPI and the impact that has on index-linked gilts. You've not mentioned it in the paper. I just wondered whether, I'm assuming that means that we don't really have very much exposure and it's not really something we need to worry about.
Yes, I think that is correct. If you look at the size of the gilts portfolio, it's really quite small. So I don't think it's something that the fund needs to worry too much about. But as you highlight, that there is a move from 2030, so it's a little bit far out, and there is a small proportion. It's a relatively small proportion of the fund in gilts, and an even smaller proportion of the fund in gilts beyond the 2030 period. So, not a major impact from an asset point of view.
Okay. Do we have any other questions? Getting off lightly there, Bruce?
I'm sure there'll be more later.
Happy to agree the recommendations?
Yep.